Hi friends, welcome to Knowledge Share. So it's been a long time. So today we are going to see how to use PnPCore SDK for accessing large list. I hope many of you are aware of what is PnPCore SDK and how it can be used and why is it used. So let me give some basic information about PnPCore SDK, and then we will see how we can use the SDK to access large list in SharePoint Online. So this is the URL for PnPCore SDK, which is pnp.github.io/pnpcore, and here you can see the detailed information about what is PnPCore SDK and how we can use this SDK to communicate with SharePoint using the SharePoint REST API or Graph API, and you can see the full documentation here, and also what are all the interfaces or DLLs used, and you can also find samples, different samples for Azure Functions, ASP.NET Core app, Blazor app, even for Raspberry Pi. Okay, and you can also find some tutorial where you can see how they have used different authentication mechanism to communicate with SharePoint. And the most interesting part is, if you are very much eager and if you want to contribute, you can even take part in the contribution, and then you can contribute to this SDK. Okay, so this is some basic information about PnPCore SDK model, and let's see how we can access the large list. So first let me navigate to the list SharePoint site and show the list, so how much data it holds. So this is my SharePoint site, and if you see site contents, so here you can see a list named SIF master, which has around 14,076 items. And if you see the list settings here, so it already crossed the list view threshold, which is 5,000. Okay, so in case if you try to access this list like using the normal query, you will get an exception. So now we will see how we can use PnPCore SDK, and then how to access the items, how to filter the items from this list. So let us move to Visual Studio. So here I have created a sample console application, and if you see the app settings.json, so here these are all the properties for the PnPCore. So SharePoint REST, how much time we have to retry, whether we need to retry or not, and for Microsoft Graph, if there is any failure, whether we need to retry or not, and the context, whether to use Graph first and then SharePoint REST API, or you need to use only Graph API, and even you can choose to use Graph beta version. And here I have used one of the authentication method named Credential Manager, and you can also use other authentication like interactive certificate. So here I have used the default configuration as Credential Manager, and for this also you need to register an app, get the client ID, tenant ID, and give necessary permission based on the functionality of the application, what you are going to do, whether you are going to access only the items and files or you are going to create a list. So based on that, you have to define your permission in the app registration. Okay, and here the Credential Manager, here I have used M365 Dev Practice as a Credential Manager name, which holds the credential for the site. And here I have configured the site URL is this, and the authentication mechanism is Credential Manager. You can configure multiple authentication, and then you can just pass in which authentication provider you are trying to use it, and this is just for logging. So this is the main settings which is required for PnPCore. Okay. Next is the authentication, how to configure this settings. So here I have created auth.cs. Before going into the code, let us see what are all the packages we need to use. So if you see here, I have used only two packages. One is microsoft.extensions.hosting, which is used to create the builder and configure services and mainly to use dependency injection. And the next package is pnp.core.auth, which helps us to configure PnP and then communicate with SharePoint Online. Okay. So here I have two CS files. One is auth.cs, which holds how the PnP is configured, and based on this it returns the context, and using the context we will connect to the SharePoint site and then we will do whatever we need to do in SharePoint. Okay, so this is here, this is what I have configured. Logging, I haven't configured any logging. And for the starters, what you can do is you can just configure logging.add console. What it does is, whenever you execute the function and whenever the PnP makes a call, it will detail out the information in your console. What is the query it is transferring, and whether it is making a batch call or an individual call. So you can see some information happening inside the PnP. Okay. So for now, for the demo purpose, I have just clear the providers. Next is the configure services. I have just added the PnPCore service and options from the PnPCore sections in the app settings. And I have added the PnPCore authentication, and then the authentication options are also coming from the PnPCore section in the app settings.json. Okay. So, and then I am building it. So it's very simple. Moving to the program.js. So here I have just initialized, I have just got the host and host.services.create scope. I have just created the scope, and by using the scope I have just get the context factory, PnP context factory, and using the PnP context factory alone we can create the context for the relevant site. And here I am just creating a PnP context object, passing in the dev attribute, which is inside the site's dev, which will try to access the site URL using the credential manager. So I am just giving you a very high level information on how to use PnPCore, and you can also watch PSS video where I will put a link in my description, in my video description, where he details out how many authentication and how you can use the PnPCore SDK. Okay, so now let us focus on what we are trying to see. So here I am just getting the web information to make sure that PnP is correctly accessed our site. So this is the first method. So here I am just declaring the list, which is shift master, and I am declaring the query items variable, so which I will be reusing it for different access. Let us go through the code and then we'll try to execute the code once we have gone through the code. Okay, so first, if you see the query, it's very simple query. I have just used order by ID as ascending, and then I have just returning the ID field. So this section is used to get the total items. So since I have already shown the total items is 14,076, let us see whether it is returning the total item count or exception. So here I am just calling get list data with camel query, passing in the context, list title, and also the query. This method will be reused for all the different scenarios. So let us first see what is this method is. So here I am just getting the list. So these are all the minimal properties which you need to get it from the list in order to access the list and the items. So here I am just getting the title, and also for the fields, internal name, kind, type, a string, and then the field title. And I have declared the paging size and the next page. And here I am using the data, list data as stream. So there are multiple methods available in PnPCore SDK. Like let me navigate to the PnPCore SDK. Go to the list items and overview, and if you see here reading list items, here you can see each section has a sample that illustrate how you can use it. So items via paging, and this is one of the method, load items by camel query. And another method is list data as stream approach. This is what we are using it. Based on my experience and my research, I prefer to use this method, load list data as stream async, which is very powerful and very useful instead of using the load list as camel query method. Both the list, the arguments will be same. We are passing the same camel query, but the way it returns the result is different. And you can have a lot of additional information which you can use it. Okay. So here I am just using load list data as stream, where I am passing in the camel query option, rendering option as list data, paging. Here I am just assigning the paging to the next page, and then dates in UTC as true. So once this method is executed, we are checking whether the output has next href, which is a paging attribute. So the main thing to notice here is, since it is a large list, we cannot just get the data or maybe with one call. We have to make multiple calls without hitting the throttling exception, and that is the reason I have created many scenarios which I'll be showing later, so that for each scenario we can see what is the item count and how the PnPCore SDK is reflecting the items. So next page, and if the output doesn't have the next h reference, we are just declaring the paging equal to false. And then we have a return items, which is the collection where the entire method, the entire logic is inside the paging. So whenever the paging is available, we are just trying to get the items batch by batch and then adding the items to this collection. And once it is done, we are returning the items finally. Okay. So now let's see. Okay, so this is where we are calling it, and here if you see, I am just returning the total number of items. So here I haven't used any row limit. If you see the query, I have just used order by and view fields. There is no row limit. Okay, so this is the first scenario. The second scenario, if you see here, I have used the row limit. So 2000. So what it does is, what it should do, what is the main objective of including the row limit is, we just need to check only the first 2000 items. We don't want to check the entire 14,000. We are just going to loop only through the 2000 items. So that is so here I am just getting the total number of items. Since I have given here the row limit as 2000, so it will return the total number of items as 2000 instead of 14k plus. So let us see once it is executed. The third query is, here I have used row limit with paging. So if you see here, there is a new attribute called paged equal to true, which is added. So what it does is, it will create a paging with each page as 2000 items. So until it reaches the end of 14K, it will loop through and then it will return the count. So this is for getting the total number of items. So what happens if we are using filter? Whether we need to include the row limit for filter or with the paged attribute or not. So for that case, I have created this query where I am just checking filtering the SIF status. SIF status is nothing but choice column. If I am correct, yes, it is a choice column where it has active or closed and empty. So based on this column, we are filtering the data. At least 5000 plus record will be available for each status. So here I am just trying to filter it using active. So it should return more than 5000 items, which is also a threshold limit. So let us see what's happening. Okay. So here I haven't included any row limit. So if you see here, just where condition, order by, and then view fields. And I'm just using the same get list data. So here I have used, I don't think so this method is required. So we can just pass in the query. The second scenario is here I have used a row limit with the filtering condition. And I think here also we can pass in just the query items. And the third is where I have used a paged attribute with the filtering condition. And here too we will change it to query items. Okay, so that's it. So let us execute this console and let us see how it is returning the items count based on the scenarios. Let us see how it is returning. Okay, let us wait for the console to be executed. Okay, patience, it is executing. Yeah. So the first thing is getting the web information. So if you see here, the first method, what I am doing is getting the web information, and it's just displaying the web title and the ID, which is web title and the ID. The second is trying to get the total items without row limit. So without row limit, this is a query. When I am trying to execute it, it is returning the throttle exception because the list items already exceeded. So without the row limit, this scenario fails. So the next is including the row limit. So here, trying to total number of items with row limit in camel query. So here with row limit only 2000. Since we have included 2000, the total number of items with that row limit is only 2000. So it will search only for the 2000. It will not go beyond that. Okay. The next is including the paged attribute. Okay. So here if you see, it has returned the total number of items as 14076, which is exactly the same items which resides in the list. So the count is correct only when we included the row limit with paged attribute. So now let us see how the filtering items works. So here, when we are trying to filter the items without any row limit, even though the active status, the items with the active status is more than 5000, but if you see here, the list threshold is 5000. So it is returning the total count only as 4999. It is not going beyond that, but it didn't return any throttle exception, but it returned only 4,999 items. Now when I include row limit, it is returning only 2000 because it searched for 2000 items, and within the 2000 items all the items are active. So it returned 2000. The last filter query is based on the row limit as well as the paged attribute, which is the accurate result. If you see here, it returns 8519, which is more than 5000K and more than threshold, but it returns without any error. So what you learn is, when you are using PnPCore SDK to query a large list items using the camel query, I always prefer camel query, which is very easy for us to define and easy to understand. You must include the row limit as well as the paged attribute. Only if you include the paged attribute, you will be able to get this H reference, and then you will be able to iterate through the paging. And whatever method, whatever technique or information I am explaining here is based on this load list data, because if you are using load list as camel query, the approach will be different. So if you see here, this is load list data as, so it has next H reference attribute, and we are directly checking this attribute. But if you are looking for load items by camel query, where it's a different approach, where you have to calculate the pages and you have to design the page URL using the last item ID, which is retrieved from the previous execution. So based on this, you can page through the large list. So sometimes based on my experience, sometimes this is returning some issues for the filters when the list has 700 or 800K items. So my suggestion is, I always prefer load list data as stream async. So I have done many migrations from on-premise to online, and for report kind of a thing. So I have done many development using PnPCore SDK. For all the development, I prefer to use load list data as stream. So this is my preference, but I'm not saying that you should use this method, but it has more advantage compared to the other method. So I have already shown the advantage of using the paged attribute and the load list method. So that's it, guys. So this is a very short video because recently I have been exploring these things and I have been running into many issues, and I got this solution worked out. So I thought I can share with you all. Thanks for your time. I hope you learned something new regarding the PnPCore SDK. So in future, I'll be showing some unique approach or unique functionalities or some unique method with SharePoint Online. Maybe I'm also exploring some Power Apps and other things. So you can expect some great videos in future. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Always love you guys. Love the community. Sharing is always caring. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Cheers. Bye.